Hello. Today I will introduce you to the relationship between a landlord and a tenant, their duties to one another, and we'll discuss various types of leases, rights, and duties of tenants and landlords, tort liability of each, and the various assignments and leases. Now, this is part 2 of our lecture. However, we're only going to be discussing half of part of chapter 6 today. And then tomorrow we will finish up chapter 6. Upon completion of this chapter, you should be able to identify and describe the various types of tenancies, understand the rights and duties of the tenant, discuss the landlord's duties under a lease, explain tort liability of the landlord and the tenant, and discuss assignments and subleases. Let's begin with leases. A leasehold is a possessory interest in property, but it is not an ownership interest. A leasehold is rooted in feudal times and stems from the idea that it is a tenant who holds under a landlord, which is the lessor of the property. The lease describes the relationship between the parties as lessor and lessee. The most notable types of leaseholds include the periodic tenancy, the tenancy for years, the tenancy at will, and the tenancy at sufferance, which we'll discuss in a moment. The tenant is the person or business who rents property and is also called the lessee. The landlord is the one who rents the property and is also called the lessor. Like all contracts, a lease will determine who the parties are, the terms under which the relationship will take shape, the period of time for the relationship, and the rights to termination. It will also include the signatures of the parties. As is the case in many breach of contract actions, if a tenant breaches the lease, the contract, the landlord is required to mitigate his own damages. Additionally, a lease may contain an acceleration clause, which, upon a default by the lessee, requires that all payments due during the life of the lease be made immediately. Acceleration is more typical in a commercial lease where a business is the tenant and breaches the contract, because typically a lease for business, or a commercial lease as it's called, is for large sums of money and a large space, an entire floor or multiple floors of a large building. And so if a business breaches that lease, then the landlord will enforce the acceleration clause, making them pay the remainder of the lease, which is an incentive on the business's part not to breach the lease. So let's discuss the 4 types of leaseholds, which again are the tenancy for years, periodic tenancy, tenancy at will, and the tenancy at sufferance. So let's look at the tenancy for years first. A tenancy for years is created when the landlord and the tenant agree on a specific duration for the lease, and is the most common type of leasehold. The tenancy for years is an estate in the property for a fixed period of time. The fixed period of time can be from 6 months to several years. And the key feature of a tenancy for years is that the beginning and ending dates are fixed and computable. In a tenancy for years, no notice is needed to terminate the leasehold. Since the lease has a specified end date, the leasehold simply ends on the last day of the lease, and the tenant is required to vacate the premises. A periodic tenancy is a tenancy created when a lease specifies intervals at which payments are due, but does not specify how long the lease is for. The periodic tenancy will continue from one period to the next automatically unless one of the parties terminates at the end of a notice period. At common law, 6 months' notice was required to terminate a year-to-year tenancy. However, today, many jurisdictions only require 30 days' notice to terminate the lease. Typically, that would be stated in the lease as well. Periodic tenancies are created when an express agreement exists, so a written contract, or by implication when the lease is from year to year, month to month, without any specified ending date. By operation of law, if the tenant remains in possession after the termination of a tenancy for years. For example, suppose Mary stays in her apartment past the term of her 4-year period of time. She continues to pay the specified rent, and the landlord continues to accept her checks. Then a periodic tenancy has been created by inference as a result of both of their actions. She continues to pay, he continues to accept, and therefore the lease is automatically continued. A tenancy at will is a lease that may be terminated at any time by either party. A tenancy at will has no stated duration, and a tenancy at will must be created by an express writing. It may be terminated at any time without notice, or it can terminate by operation of law. The next tenancy is a tenancy at sufferance, which is a tenancy created when a tenant retains possession or holds over property after the expiration of another tenancy or a life estate without the owner's consent. In order to end the lease, the landlord has to take steps to evict the tenant. The landlord has two choices when a tenant holds over. The landlord can evict the tenant, in which case the landlord has to give a notice of eviction, usually 30 days, and or sometimes 10 days, and request a hearing in front of the magistrate judge. So in Morgantown, if you're being evicted, you'll get notice of anywhere between 10 and 30 days, and then you'll have to appear before the magistrate judge, in which case he will either evict you or you may have the ability to pay your back rent and stay in the apartment. The other option is for the landlord to hold the tenant to another term as a tenant, in which case the tenant must pay rent according to the original agreement. In that case, if you're holding over, which is, so let's say you have a year lease and you're supposed to be out in May, you have no desire to leave, but you haven't actually told the landlord that you plan to stay. You just stay in the apartment and you pay your rent the next month. The landlord accepts it. You pay your rent the following month. The landlord accepts it. Well, then the landlord can hold you to a full year term then, in which case you're on the hook for the next year's lease. This concludes the lecture for today. Tomorrow we'll finish up the week by discussing the rest of Chapter 6. Thanks.